The 8th generation of consoles was a radical departure in strategy for both Sony and Microsoft, spurred by demand for gamers who are increasingly wanting improved visual quality in their games, but also, and perhaps of even more critical importance, the release of cheap 4K TVs to the marketplace. Now, there wasn't a huge price gap between buying a large 1080p screen and a pretty decent 4K TV set, and the base model consoles were just woefully inadequate in powering such displays. So, Sony launched the PlayStation 4 Pro in November of 2016, while Microsoft followed suit a year later with the Xbox One X. In terms of the spec wars, the Xbox One X did outperform the PlayStation 4 Pro. Outfitted with 40 Polaris compute units, Microsoft cranked those CUs as high as they could possibly go, and also coupled this with 12GB of GDDR5 memory. The major weak point of both next-generation systems and their refreshes, though, was still the CPU. Microsoft tried to counter this by pushing the clock frequency of the 8 Jaguar cores to 2.3 GHz, 200 MHz faster than the PlayStation 4 Pro, and 550 MHz faster than the Xbox One. However, it still was a system that was drastically pushing the needle towards the GPU side of the equation, and Microsoft had also chosen to provide a few hardware tweaks as well, such as implementing DX12 commands directly onto the silicon. This was in an effort to reduce the CPU utilization, and it was a pretty impressive success. The APU, though, was monstrous for the system. Microsoft dubbed it the Scorpio Engine, and it was produced on TSMC's 16nm process, and weighed an impressive 359mm squared. So the question is, why am I going through a history lesson of what happened several years ago? After all, we're looking forward to the future, and both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X will launch in holiday 2020. Well, understanding the decisions of the previous generation are going to be of critical importance, understanding why Microsoft and Sony have changed their approach with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, not only in the design of the system, but also just as critically the marketing of the next generation consoles as well. With the mid-generation refresh, Microsoft and Sony cranked up the T-flop numbers of the GPU, but the old base model consoles were still holding back what developers could achieve with these mid-refreshed systems. Furthermore, compounding to the issue, they still had limitations such as I/O, with their slow read-write speeds from their respective hard drives. My name's Paul, and in this ReadyGamingTech.com video, we're going to be starting part 1 of our Xbox Series X analysis, as well as kicking off things for the next generation console analysis as large. This is going to be part 1, and as such we're going to touch on some of the basic aspects of the system. We will be discussing things like GPU performance, some of the rumours, and also what we can expect from the machines. In the sequel to this, we will also be examining next generation features such as what hardware ray tracing will bring to the table, and also console specific features for the next generation such as variable rate shading, which has been around on the PC for some time now, however is going to play a critical role in the next generation consoles. In the so-called bit wars of the early day consoles, marketing could be boiled down to 8-bit is worse than 16-bit, and so on. Of course, this wasn't strictly true, and anyone who saw the Jaguar 64 Wii's running code compared to any of its competitors, such as the PlayStation 1, the Saturn, or Nintendo's N64, would tell you that bits aren't the be-all and end-all. But, just like that era, it was now all about the T-flops. Sony advertising heavily the T-flop lead over the original Xbox One, and Microsoft happily turned the tables for the Xbox One X, trumpeting its 6 T-flops performance over the PlayStation 4 Pro's 4.2 T-flops. But now, efficiency and performance and features are the name of the game, and is almost certainly increased power consumption also the name of the game. This is a shift in marketing messaging. Things are still developing for the next generation Xbox and PlayStation, and we'll do a deeper dive into the two consoles versus one another soon. I'm currently actually working on that. But for now, I feel that such content would be lacking context, and thus I decided to release this video. The Xbox Series X is said to be, in terms of case size, around twice the physical volume of the Xbox One X, which caused polarizing opinions, to say the least, over its design. It's not a small, discrete box which can be tucked into your media center. Instead, it looks more like a small form-factor PC build, designed to house high-performance parts, but without them, of course, catching on fire. I've not had a chance to inspect the inner mechanisms of the console, but it doesn't take much to assume that we'll see a return of a robust cooling system, like Microsoft implemented in the Xbox One X. Phil Spencer in particular is pledging that the console will be, quote, as quiet as an Xbox One X. Funnily enough, and circling back to my Jaguar comments from earlier, Microsoft have actually asked users to do the math. Ironically, this was a key marketing message from Atari in the Jaguar 64 era. This isn't to say that I think for one moment that the Xbox Series X is going to be like the Jaguar and a massive failure. I just think that the marketing message is kind of amusing given the historical context. But getting from what I find personally amusing to the performance of the system, Microsoft would be keen to point out a 4-fold increase in raw performance from the CPU alone, with a 2 times increase in GPU performance, which would pin the console down to around the 12 T-flop mark. There is debate whether this is really a 12 T-flop GPU or closer to a 9 T-flop GPU with RDNA's efficiency making up the remainder. Given that Navi/RDNA is way more efficient than Polaris, we'll get more to that in a moment. However, I'm fairly confident that this is not the case. Firstly, subtle nuance like how efficient a GPU architecture is lost in the majority of individuals, and Phil Spencer and his team would get called out failing to live up for the promise of 2 times performance if the GPU was only, say, 9 T-flops, no matter what the actual technical capabilities of the system were. The second is that several leaks and sources from websites such as Eurogamer, Windows Central, have all stated that 12 T-flops is accurate. I myself have seen an alleged internal document which was, apparently anyway, from earlier in the concept of the design of the system, and here 10 T-flops was mentioned as a minimum target. I was, however, told by this individual that the team have since blown past this figure for the Xbox Series X, which is, of course, previously known as the codename of Anaconda, and is now 12 T-flops. I, however, am uncertain whether this is really true, but still, the document did look fairly genuine. But before we get into the speculation side of the equation, let's go with what we know already for certain. The RX 5700 XT is currently the highest end Navi SKU we know, though it is using the first generation of RDNA, and we'll discuss more about that in a moment. This is particularly interesting because this piece of silicon is not small, despite the fact it's being produced on the 7nm TSMC process. It weighs in at 251 mm squared, housing 40 compute units, and these chips are running at around 2 GHz, albeit with higher power consumption and heat output that would be ideal. For the PlayStation 5, we have seen several APU and GPU benchmarks pegging the GPU to hit 1800 to 2 GHz. And also, we've seen well-known leaker Komachi find a reference to a almost certain PS5 GPU which has 3 clock frequencies. The first would be the PS5's native clock speed, which appears to be 2 GHz, and there are also 2 other references to 800 MHz and 911 respectively for the PS4 and PS4 Pro backwards compatibility. We can therefore assume that the Xbox Series X GPU would be similarly clocked, and if it is, 40 compute units is not going to cut it. You could do the maths yourself if you'd like. You take 40, that's the number of compute units, times 64, because that's the number of ALUs / shaders if you prefer, per compute unit. You times that by whatever clock frequency, you can say 2000, which would represent 2 GHz, and then you times that by 2 again, which is the operations per clock. If you do this, at 2 GHz, MS would only hit 10.2 T-flops for the Xbox Series X. So what we're actually more likely to see is something like 48 compute units being the minimum number to achieve 12 T-flops. And then, if one of these CU is defective, the whole APU would need to be ditched. Theoretically though, this could also be used for Lockhart, as this particular SKU is reported to be a 4 T-flop system, and would represent the lower end of the next generation Xbox family. Realistically though, this is not the case. Microsoft would like to have some level of margin of error built into the APU. Take the PlayStation 4 APU for example, which had 20 CU on board. However, 2 were always disabled, leaving just 18. So if Sony had managed to have a chip which was perfect and no CUs were damaged during manufacturing, great, but the console would still only have 18 functional compute units. On the other hand, let's say that 1 or 2 was damaged, not a problem. They had accounted for these problems and they would still have a fully functional die. And also, it's hard to believe though that Microsoft, as well as Sony of course, wouldn't follow suit with this strategy for the next generation of consoles. Given that the verbal and written confirmations from Microsoft that we'll see a hardware-accelerated ray tracing solution in the next generation of Xbox, and several comments of next-gen RDNA, it's almost 100% certain that Microsoft are opting for RDNA 2, aka RDNA Next Generation, for their next generation Xbox. That's a lot of next generations. I was the first to break that RDNA 2, known as Nave 2X, would have hardware ray tracing, and also leaked the existence of Nave 21 and 23, the latter of which is known as the Nvidia killer. This means that the performance of these next generation GPUs should be impressive, at least in theory. One of the later things I've also learned is that the next generation of RDNA is not just going to be RDNA 1, albeit with ray tracing slapped on top. Apparently, the architecture itself is more efficient than the current RDNA, which itself, the first generation of RDNA that is, puts out more work than Vega, around 25% more work actually, per shader running at the same clock frequency, also known as instructions per clock. Details are scarce on AMD or Microsoft's implementation of ray tracing, but we have seen a patent for it, and it's being dubbed as a hybrid approach. I'll go much deeper into this in the future, although a few patents in Microsoft's recent tweaks to DXR, DirectX ray tracing, likely hold some clues if you'd like to look them up yourself. They've recently nudged it to tier 1.1, with numerous enhancements and improvements. I will also delve into other underlying technologies such as variable rate shading, as that will also be a rather interesting technology for games. But I want to keep this video, as much as I can anyway, kind of organised, lest, well, it could become just a sprawling mess to be totally honest. So what about the CPU? Well, as I mentioned at the start of this video, the CPU inside both Sony and Microsoft's current generation consoles is easily their weakest link. Even with the PS4 base console, for example, Sony outfitted it with a 1.6 GHz Jaguar CPU, running with 8 CPU cores. They did crank this up to 2.1 GHz for the PS4 Pro, but not all of those cores are allocated to games. Sony and Microsoft did release an update part of the way through the system's life. I believe it was in like a year's time or something after the system's launched, where it allowed developers to access some of the 7th CPU core time to run game code, should developers wish it. It's not all of the 7th core though. It's around 50% of the 7th core for both machines, So that means that 6 full Jaguar cores are at the disposal of developers, and 50% of Core 7, with the remaining 1.5 cores, I suppose you could say, being used for system tasks. The PS5 and Xbox Series X are confirmed to both use Zen 2 in an 8-core configuration with SMT, simultaneous multi-threading. Clock speeds are not official yet. The leaked APU for the PS5 seems to show a 3.2 GHz clock frequency for the CPU. Potentially, of course, this could change for release, whereas the Xbox Series X is being reported to run at 3.5 GHz by Windows Central, as well as a couple of other reports as well. So, how does this compare to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One's Jaguar processors? It just doesn't compare, it actually stomps them. There's a rather interesting series of benchmarks from a user who'd gotten Geekbench 4 to run on a PS4 Pro. Thanks to an exploit, he was able to run Linux and lost the benchmark. His Geekbench score was 1400 for a single core, and 7684 for multi-core. I did a few runs myself using a Ryzen 7 3700X, as it makes a good stand-in for the 8-core CPU inside the next generation consoles. Likely, the consoles will tweak things, but we'll discuss those differences in another time. These figures were also run on Windows versus Linux, which means scores aren't exactly an apples-to-apples comparison, but still, they're a close enough ballpark figure. Even disabling the 3700X and running it at the same clock speed as the PS4 Pro's Jaguar processors, you can see that the scores are essentially double for the Zen 2 cores. Geekbench 4 isn't indicative of all workloads by any stretch of the imagination, and clearly, as developers optimize their code for consoles, things will likely differ, and I suspect the performance gap will increase even further. We've also seen some recent demos from AMD showing FemFX, which is code running on the CPUs which is able to better mimic how materials deform, bend and react in the natural world. Realistic graphics are important, of course, such as ray tracing being implemented in the next generation, but we've also all played games or run into things which totally break the realism, such as a piece of cloth which acts more like plywood. Or wondered why you can use a flamethrower, for example, on a tin can, and just notice it seems to just laugh at you. Of course, some physics and workloads will still likely be run on the GPU as compute commands, but with vastly more CPU performance now available to them, developers are given access to create richer worlds. And also, CPU performance will no longer be a limiting factor in high frame rates too. High refresh rates gamings were often held back on console because of the lackluster processor inside both machines. And now for competitive titles, 120Hz could now be targeted, potentially dialing back other details as necessary, but focusing on high response rates and frame rates above all else. I'll also go into this deeper in a future video. What we do have at the moment is very little official information of the APU of both consoles, although potentially Microsoft did give us a sneak peek of the APU at E3 2019, which was of course Microsoft's first reveal of the system, although it was more of a tease. The APU looked monstrous, but given the angles it's very difficult to get an accurate measurement of the beast. But it looks like it's roughly the same size as the Scorpio Engine inside the Xbox One X, so probably around the 350mm squared, maybe up to 370mm squared at most. That's a guess though. Once again, the fact that it's using such heavy angles doesn't help. And honestly, this APU could be a complete red herring. We even saw Microsoft use a different set of RAM inside the machine. There was actually 1GB and 2GB GDDR6 modules inside, which most likely was to help throw off people who are investigating such things. But still, let's say that it is 350mm squared. In terms of CU, with the current generation of RDNA, a work group is coming in at around 4.5 to 4.6mm squared. Each workgroup, by the way, is 2 compute units. Liabe Brave over at NeoGAF did a really nice breakdown of the Nave 10 Silicon, featured inside the RX 5700 series. He also tried estimating the size of a workgroup processor in the next generation of RDNA. But honestly, I would take that figure with a huge grain of salt, given we don't know how much the architecture will evolve. But realistically, I'm probably going to agree with him, it's not going to get that much bigger, particularly given that the next generation console is most likely going to be manufactured on TSMC's 7nm Plus process. This will probably all be offset anyway. In terms of raw size then, the low 50 compute units being active, running at a nippy clock speed and backed up by 8 Zen 2 cores seems most probable. I speculate to save a decent chunk of die space, the Zen 2 CPU cores will have their level 3 cache snipped by about 50%. This isn't confirmed, naturally, but what we do know is that the 74nm² chiplets of the Ryzen 3000 series, for example, have just about half of their die space taken up by level 3 cache, because it's 32 megabytes. Halving it therefore to 16 might be a good way for them to claw back die space, if push came to shove and they felt it was a good trade-off. I'm sure Microsoft would be very eager at this point I discuss one element of the next generation Xbox which is definitely a huge upgrade compared to the current generation, and that's storage. One of the worst kept secrets of the next generation was always the SSDs inside of them, and the goal is apparently to virtually eliminate load times of games, thanks to the massive increase of I/O. On the surface, that may not sound that cool. I mean, yeah, sure, it's a nice quality of life improvement, but not necessarily something that will impact your enjoyment of games that much. Sure, at least you won't have to watch the loading screen tick by for a minute or two, right? But still, what it does do, if you scratch beneath the surface, is actually radically and drastically change how a game can be constructed, and also provide developers a lot of additional options. Do you remember the first time you loaded up Castlevania Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation 1? And when you went from one area of the game to the next, you had to walk through that corridor. This was all an effort to disguise the loading from the PlayStation 1's CD drive, as it throwed data from the CD to the PS1's meager amount of RAM. What about Mass Effect and their infamous elevators? They seemed to last just a bit too long for elevators of the future, but of course, the same thing was true here. It was all an effort to disguise the loading from one area to the next. Exactly the same as Castlevania Symphony of the Night, albeit with shinier graphics. Please understand I'm not criticising the games or the systems. I'm merely pointing out that that was a limitation of that generation, and indeed this generation too. Imagine how seamless a world could potentially be constructed with the ability for a system to stream vast amounts of data. You could instantly teleport, or fast travel I suppose, with the game barely missing a beat from one location to another. This could lead to very interesting experiences. One of the few demos we've had of this so far is Sony running Spider-Man on a PlayStation 5 development kit. He can traverse the city at much faster rates than the PS4 or PS4 Pro, simply because of the speed that Sony can pull the data off of the SSD. Unfortunately, information what the Xbox Series X and Lockhart, and of course the PS5 will be outfitted with is, well, let's just say limited. However, it's difficult to not imagine it'll be similar to the faster SSDs which are available now. Seek times are a necessary evil with the spinning mechanical platter of the current generation drives, because it means that the read head could be on the other side of the disk, and as you can imagine, it takes time for it to physically travel and then locate the missing piece of data on that disk. Some will point to the fact that you can use SSDs on the PS4 right now, for example, and it does help with loading times, but it doesn't really provide a huge performance benefit. This is true, but it's by design. The PlayStation 4 launched with a pretty paltry SATA 2 interface, for example, which was subsequently upgraded to SATA 3 later on with the arrival of the PlayStation 4. But compare this to an NVMe SSD, and SATA is extremely sluggish. But worse than this, developers were not coding experiences designed to take advantage of an SSD, because the console just did not have one by default. The story of the next generation of consoles is going to be extremely interesting to watch unfold, even if you are a PC gamer. Because, make no mistake about it, what happens on the next generation consoles is going to heavily impact and influence what we can expect for PC technology. Not least of all, of course, the super fast SSDs that I was speaking about a moment ago. Indeed, though, while this next generation of consoles is going to be a radical departure from the current generation, I feel it's important for us to not just go into this with the assumption that graphics are going to improve, similar to what they did with, let's say, the original Xbox to the Xbox 360, or the PS1 to the PS2. Instead, we are going to see games become more vibrant and alive, better AI, better physics, more interactivity, and a larger open world that we can explore. It will be fascinating to see what developers are able to achieve with a system which would be so capable. And I hope that you will join me on this adventure. If you've enjoyed the video, then of course I would encourage you to click the like button and also comment down below what you're personally hoping for the next generation consoles. You can also subscribe to the channel and stick with us here as we explore the next generation systems in several different videos. And this is also an article, so if you do prefer the written format, then of course you can find that also linked in the description of this very video. We're also on Patreon as well, so if you fancy helping support the channel, then of course you can find the link in the description of the video as well. But with all of that said, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.